Hey, welcome to Page Break. I'm your host, Brian McClellan, coming to you as wildfire season really gets moving here in the mountains of Utah. A quick bit of housekeeping. This is the final episode of Season 1 of Page Break. We've been running for a little over a year now and produced 49 episodes with over 75,000 downloads. You listeners have been fantastic, and I hope you'll be patient while I take the rest of the summer off to prepare for Season 2. A content warning. On this episode, we do talk a little bit about erotica, so if that makes you uncomfortable, please feel free to skip it. Now on with the show. My guest this week is author, editor, and game designer Shanna Germain. Shanna is best known as the co-founder, co-owner, and managing editor of Monte Cook Games. Over the course of her career, she's published everything from poems and articles to short stories and novels, as well as taught classes on publishing and writing. Her latest works include Numenera novels Tomorrow's Bones and The Night Clave. Shanna and I chat about her work at Monte Cook Games, her changes in creative focus, and the choices one has to make between writing time, publication, and a secure day job. We also discuss the tricky relationship that authors have with their reviews, from random Twitter comments all the way to professional trade publications. Enjoy my conversation with Shanna Germain. So I'm trying to remember if we've actually ever kind of run into each other before.
You know, I was trying to remember that too, because you look familiar, but the internet does that, right?
Yeah, exactly, right?
I was like, oh boy, I'm glad that you don't remember either. I do feel like you meet so many people now that it's really hard, especially if it's just a short, like, passing moment. You're like, oh, I don't know. What do I say? Have I met them before?
Right, and there's so many people that you kind of... you'll kind of, two ships passing in the night kind of thing, where you just like, you'll have a mutual friend that will introduce you at a convention, and you'll say hi and shake hands, and then you won't see each other again, right?
Yeah, that's so true.
Right. Okay, so you are the co-founder of Monte Cook Games.
Yes.
Which is super, super cool. I mean, they're like, I am not super well keyed into the gaming community, but it's a big enough name that I immediately recognize it. And I was kind of curious about that. I've talked to a few gaming people for this podcast, and I was very curious about kind of the genesis of that. Where does one start off starting a gaming company?
Well, first you must know nothing. That's the first requirement. So it sort of picks up in the middle of my career in an interesting way, in that I was editing a technical coffee roasting magazine on one side, and on the other I was writing for like World of Warcraft official magazine and things like that. So I was writing about gaming, but I wasn't writing game design, and I wasn't really working in RPGs. It was more computer games. And then when Monty was thinking about kicking off a Kickstarter for this little game that he wasn't sure anyone was going to like, called Numenera, and we were talking about it, and I was like, gosh, that sounds so incredible. That sounds really wonderful. I'd love to edit that. And we were having this whole conversation. We got really excited about it. And then we Kickstarted it, and it was at the time one of the record-breaking Kickstarters at $500,000, and we didn't know what to do. We were just sort of so flabbergasted, and it was so unexpected that we were like, okay, now what? Right? We knew how to work in the writing and editing and all of those processes, but we'd never distributed a book of this sort of giant size to this number of people. And at that point, we had some really intense conversations, like, do we need to just start a company? And like talked about the commitment and talked about what that meant, as though we knew anything back then 10 years ago, which, by the way, we did not, despite thinking that we did. And we landed on, yes, we needed to start a company. We needed to hire some people to make sure that we made our promises to the Kickstarter backers. And so it just sort of happened from there. It was not something that we sort of expected or planned. We certainly didn't know that 10 years on, we'd still be doing it and have a team of 12 people. So it's been kind of a wild ride in a lot of different ways.
Well, that is absolutely wild. One of those little aspects of things like Kickstarter that I find incredibly fascinating is this idea that I mean, obviously there are lots and lots of Kickstarters that don't succeed, or that maybe, that hit exactly kind of the milestones that they hope to hit. But there's also this tiny portion of Kickstarters that do something that take like a little idea and then suddenly turn it into requiring economies of scale.
Yeah.
And that is an interesting kind of part of business, of small business suddenly being forced to be bigger, that I find really interesting. So did you guys find that was a big struggle, or did you find the process of kind of scaling up for more people to be relatively simple compared to what you thought it was going to be?
Well, it's so interesting because Kickstarter, of course, comes with its own set of like WTF moments. Like we couldn't find for a long time an accountant who understood that we were going to get all this money in a big chunk this year, but all of our expenses were going to come the following year when we sent the book to the printer and those kinds of things. And so they'd be like, well, you made $500,000 in this Kickstarter. And we were like, yeah, but next year we're going to have huge expenses. So like, please don't make us pay taxes on that because it's not going to stay. And so even from the beginning, doing it via Kickstarter was such a wonderful opportunity. And yet at the same time, it brought so many interesting challenges. And then like any small business, we worked so hard for the first 5 years because we were understaffed and we had people who were super passionate and, everyone wanted it to succeed. And, the number of hats that each of us wore in the beginning as we tried to do everything was incredible. And then I think when we hit the sort of 5 or 6 year mark, things started to shift. It felt like we sort of had grown into an adult company and things got a little bit easier, but there's always sort of rocky points through there. So yeah, it was never what we expected that was difficult, and things that we expected to be difficult sometimes surprised us with how delightfully easy they were. And most of the latter was because we have an amazing team of people who sort of stepped up or had this hidden ability that they could just be like, hey, I know how to do that, let me do that. And so it's all the good things that have happened on our team have been because of the awesome people.
Well, and I think that's incredibly important when you kind of expand beyond just yourself or yourself and a partner. You suddenly run into needing to trust other human beings to do a lot of things that could get you fined a lot of money if you don't do it right, for instance.
Right.
And this is one of my big preoccupations on the podcast is this intersection of business and creativity, which I find really quite fascinating and which a lot of people really don't like.
The intersection or the focus on it?
No, the intersection. I mean, hopefully they like to focus on it because
I was going to say I find it interesting. So
I do too, right? So a lot of people, a lot of creative people, like I find tend to be quite resentful of the fact that they have to kind of exist in this real world and kind of this capitalist society, which, you can have arguments about that kind of goodness, badness thing all over the place. But, the fact is what we work within at the moment. And I don't know, I find that really interesting. And this idea, something that I've always struggled with is this idea of working creatively with other people. I'm really quite jealous of it in these sort of related fields that tend to be much more collaborative. Game writing is one of them. Screenwriting, another one, yeah, especially television. But I don't know if I've got that kind of temperament to be able to handle, actually having my baby worked on by other people. Right. And I'm curious how you deal with that.
There's so many little tangents in that topic because it's such a big topic. So I think that there's two parts of that that really interest me, and one is the first one is that crossover of business and creativity. It's one of those situations where for me, I'm quite good at the business stuff, just sort of naturally. It's one of those things that just I don't really know how because I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I kind of get. Maybe because when you're a freelancer for a long time, which I was before, you start to understand marketing, and I wrote marketing copy. And so there's lots of parts of business that make sense to me intuitively. And in fact, because the business needed me in that aspect, I found myself letting go of the creative work to do the business work because it was easier. Because like, if, I know there are people out there who say that creative work is easy, but I am not one of them. I find it very difficult. It requires a lot of deep thought. And so for me, the hardest part sometimes was pulling myself away from sort of putting out fires or solving problems in order to actually get the work done. Because I sort of developed this mentality of, well, when all the fires are out, I will get the creative work done. And of course, the fires are never out in a small business. And so I feel like that's the struggle for me is when you're good at something and the company needs you, it's hard for me in particular to say no and focus on, it feels almost selfish to focus on the creative thing. But of course, the creative thing is what keeps the company going in many ways. And so that's the constant sort of tightrope that I'm on in those spaces. The other thing about is collaboration. I also, I crave collaboration so much. It sounds so fascinating, but I'm such an introvert that I spend, 20 minutes with someone and I'm like, I absolutely love you and adore you, but I have to go recharge my battery. And so there's something so amazing when, I have lots of friends who work in TV, and they sit around in the writer's room and they talk about those experiences. And I get so, like, it's a thing I want in another me because the me that I am, it isn't even about my creative process. It's just about, like, I find that I can't do deep work. I can't do deep thinking as easily in that sort of collaborative space. And even as a game designer, I have only just in the last couple of years started to learn how to collaborate, because typically, at least in our company, our designers find something they're excited about and then they go off and do it. And then, they might collaborate with the editor or whatever, but it's their project. And so learning how to collaborate with other designers on a project has been a very interesting experience in a lot of ways. And it has actually taught me a lot, and I've grown a lot, but I also am still gritting my teeth about sort of having to do it sometimes.
Oh, that's great. I actually, that really resonates with me, because I've never really thought about it that way. But that idea of spending a bunch of time in like a writer's room for a TV show, that is intimidating, because even though I consider myself very creative, I consider myself very good at what I do, the idea of trying to do it like on demand with other people around me, man, that is terrifying.
Yeah.
I feel like my creativity in that sort of situation would be like, have breakfast with these people and then go off and do my own thing.
Right. Be really inspired by the conversation and then go do my own thing. I think too, there's a different, like, people write differently, and all of my thinking comes through the process of writing. Like, I couldn't come up with a plot or a character or anything if I wasn't actually in the process of writing. I'm very word and sound focused. And so I do feel like I'd get in a room with a bunch of really awesome, inspiring, creative people, and I'd just be like, let me type and see what my brain comes up with. And so I do think that there are people who can just do this really amazing interactive experience of creation, but I'm not very good at it. And it's true even in, like, when I'm playing a game, like a role-playing game, my character, I'm kind of slow on that process because my creativity doesn't come through anything but sort of writing it down. And so I'm kind of a slow player even in that way. So it's interesting to see how that affects a whole bunch of different parts of my life.
I have the exact same problem with RPGs. I always feel really self-conscious about it. Like when I'm trying to play with like my high school buddies or something, there is this like expectation of, oh, Brian does this professionally. He's going to be like on his game all the time, or at least that's what's in my head.
Sure,
in my head, I think that that's what they think. And so there's moments where the DM will throw something at me that I should have seen from a mile away. And I'm just kind of like, wait, what? You're talking to me now? And I just fall apart. I fall apart under the kind of that scrutiny.
Yep.
but some people feed on that. And I genuinely, I'm very jealous of that type of person.
They're so fun to watch. And I take so much inspiration from having them in my group, because it's just like, here's the thing. And they have 20 or 30 different creative ideas about how to do a thing, and they're all awesome. And I'm still going, wait, what? What are we doing?
Now, I saw that you have worked kind of on a crazy variety of things. And I found that very fun because and I've discussed this with people on the podcast before, that me as an epic fantasy writers have a tendency to kind of get locked in to big long contracts that you're working on one universe for a long time. And that's the experience that I've had with my career so far. And I'm really interested in the type of writer who is able to jump between not just kind of genres or types of writing, but like the difference between writing a poem and writing a novel, you know? Like these are crazy things to me in terms of kind of your brain shifting gears creatively. And I was kind of curious, kind of from the beginning, where are you most comfortable? Because you seem to have done pretty much everything across that creative spectrum.
So that's a really interesting question, because the answer is, when I get comfortable with something, I leave. Because I get
Really?
bored. And that so when I hear someone, like you talk about doing like these really epic, wonderful epic sagas and big worlds and lots of books in the same world or in the same series, I love reading them, but when I think about writing that's my absolute hell. That is absolutely hell for me. And the reason is because I find myself, I get bored when something is, when I feel like I know how to do something, or when something feels the same. And so the place, weirdly, that I am the most comfortable is the place where I'm just on that cusp of, can I actually do this thing? Do I have the skills I need to do this thing? Can I learn the skills? How do I, like, I really like that place. Although when I'm in the middle of it, I really don't like that place. So it's a huge conundrum. But I really like that place of stretching myself all the time. And so I feel like I've done this sort of process where I've kind of gotten to what I consider to be my pinnacle of whatever subgenre or section of type of writing I'm doing. And then I'm like, I don't want to just keep writing the same thing over and over. I don't want to do this thing that I know how to do so easily. It's time for me to find a different genre or type or style. And I don't know. I think it's so fascinating to me, because I want to be the kind of person who can write like a trilogy, but am I ever going to be able to? I don't know. I suppose I could do it if I broke it, like Gideon the Ninth, in the way they broke their second book so much, or like, there's sort of pseudo trilogies where you don't, that interests me. But the idea of writing in the same world for longer than, I don't know, 80,000 words, I'm just like, oh no, please don't make me do that.
No, I'm curious. Do you think that's because do you think maybe that's because you really love the world building process, or I mean, I guess my brain's going there first, because my tendency is to say I'm going to put tons of work into world building something, but once that work is in, I don't want to leave that world for a long time, because I've front loaded all of this work, and now I want to spend the time to play in this sandbox and not have to do that work again for 5 years. And that's where my brain goes. And I'm curious if there's any kind of thought in your brain that's the opposite.
I can totally see that. For me, I love this idea that you build the sandbox and play in it for a really long time. I don't want to do it, but I love the idea. For me, world building comes through the writing process. And so like I find that that's the great joy, is just sort of starting to encapsulate. And I'm also really voice focused. So I try to encapsulate the voice in every piece that I do. And, I can only consistently carry a voice for so long before it starts to disintegrate or bleed into something else. And so I find that everything that I think of, every idea I think of, seems to have a concrete shape, and those shapes just are smaller. But I do think a lot of it is that, like, I love starting a thing and being like, okay, what's this new world? What are these people like? What are the creatures like? What's the language? Like, I'm fascinated by that process of, do they live on the sea and therefore their language sounds different so it can carry across water? Do they live in the mountains and their language sounds different because they need to, do that? And like, I fall in love with that process. And so I want to do it as often as I can. I suspect there's also a little bit of just an inability to stick with a thing, because that's sort of like, I've lived all over the world and I've like had a bunch of different jobs. And I mean, I sort of, I just heard this really beautiful phrase the other day that was the purgatory of the mundane. And I was thinking about that, of course, in terms of, still being in COVID situations, but also like, I think that I've spent a lot of my life sort of running from the purgatory of the mundane, and doing something that I've already done feels like that to me. And I know that there are tons of people who feel that's their best space. They love it. They want to do the same thing, and that's awesome. It's just not for me. It doesn't ping the creativity passion the way that something new and harder does.
Yeah. I found that people with kind of creative backgrounds and creative kind of styles, they seem almost to regard that idea of kind of life safety. I don't know, does that make sense? Like career safety. They almost
Yeah.
regard that in a very different way from normal people.
It's
Because
hard
normal
not
people,
to.
yeah, normal people say, oh, there's, like, oh, I'm going to work my way up from employee to manager to so and so, and they climb companies, and that's kind of how they operate, and they like that because there's a security to it. There's a security in feeling like they're going to have the same paycheck every 2 weeks for, that escalates, for the rest of their lives. And I feel like creative people almost don't even like, sometimes I forget that's a thing. Like, I'll be talking to my friends and they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm hoping for a raise. If they don't give me a raise this year, I'm definitely going to this other company who's been kind of eyeballing me. And my brain's just kind of going, wow, you guys have like benefits and things like that. And I don't know, maybe to be creative, you kind of almost have to have a little bit of a disconnect from your own financial security.
Yeah, I suspect it's different for everyone, right? And I mean, I can remember when I spent a lot of years like bartending, which is a weirdly lucrative business when you're young, and and that allowed me like 2 days off to work on my writing. And I was aware that I was making this trade-off all the time, where I didn't have as much time to write as I wanted to, but I also didn't need to care as much about whether or not things sold because I had this sort of other job, which I think a lot of people do, right? It buys us so much freedom as creatives. But I think that there's also a question of values. Like, my values are not to be rich. That's never been my value. My value is to be safe and be able to buy food and all those things so that I can do what I love. And so I do think it's sometimes just maybe creatives are more aware of what their values are, and sometimes have the ability to choose around those values. Like, I wouldn't trade, my time to be super rich, because my time is not endless, and I want to do what I want to do with that time, even if it means that, I'm never going to fly private or anything like that. So I don't know. I feel like there's this interesting thing where we are always making this choice, or at least asking the question of, what are my values, and what am I giving up if I'm going to do a 9 to 5 kind of job and that kind of stuff.
Do you think about your career much in kind of a larger abstract way?
Oh, interesting. Do I think about? Yes, I think so. I mean, boy, that's a you're asking such good questions. I feel like, I should have prepared. I do think about my career, but more so I think about what I'm deeply in love with, or deeply excited about, or passionate about, or what feels a little dangerous in some way. And so I do think about my career, but also, like, there's two parts of my brain, and one part is the person that runs a company. And so I'm thinking at that point about, like, is it time to give our employees a raise, a cost of living raise, because inflation is going up, and do they have good health insurance? And those kinds of things are interesting to think about as we talk about real jobs versus creative, because I'm helping make those decisions, right, on that space. And then there's this part of me that is also the writer, creative part, who doesn't want to think about those things very much at all. And so do I think, yes, I think about my career, but I try to keep it focused on me and my passions, because, like, we all know, right, careers are tumultuous, and the internet can take you down in a day and ruin you for, I don't know, 36 hours or however long the internet mob lasts before everything falls apart. And I feel like there is no way I can plan my career outside of myself. So I can only do what I love and hope that it's good enough and important enough to the people who also love it to do well, which is really not a career advice recommendation in any way. Although maybe it is. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go all cliche and be like, do what you love and you'll get the money will come, because we know that that's not true. But yeah, balancing those goals allows me to really think about what I'm excited about.
Hey Page Break listeners, Brian here, rudely interrupting myself for a bit of a plug. Making a podcast isn't free, and I'm hoping that you enjoy it enough to pitch in a pittance. To do so, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak, where you can toss as little as $3 a month into the tip jar, $5 a month to get the podcast ad-free and early, and $10 a month to hear your name in the credits and feel a smug sense of superiority. You can also buy my books from your favorite retailer, or direct from my website. Thanks to everyone who contributes. Now back to me. What is a dangerous decision that you have made before?
It's so I have made dangerous decisions in that I have, left. So my career path is sort of like rise to the top of a thing, right? So I was a newspaper reporter for a while, and I kind of was at that sort of as high as I could go in that, and then I quit it. And I helped start this feminist women's magazine that didn't have any money and had no support, and we were all volunteering. And, then that got grants and kind of rose to this high as I was going to go. And I was done with that. And I started writing erotica, and then got into like all the best of eroticas. And I was kind of done with that. And I quit that, even though that was very well paying. And I was like, I'm going to write poems for a while. And so I feel like I have throughout my career sort of made these like financially dangerous, right? And also career dangerous, because when people fall in love with your writing in a particular space, like, I had a lot of people who sort of followed me and were interested in my erotic work. Like, when you stop doing that, they're mad at you. They can be mad at you because you have now started writing something else that doesn't interest them, and they want to know when you're going back to the old thing. But like, the thing that's hard for me to talk about or hard for me to explain is that I couldn't think of it. For example, I couldn't think of any more ways to write about sex. Like, if I kept writing in the erotica field, it wasn't going to be good. Like, I could just tell that I had hit the point where I didn't have anything left to say. I didn't have any more stories to explore. And so it didn't feel dangerous on like a personal, passionate level, but it felt dangerous on a financial sort of career path level to kind of just keep leaving things. And so, yeah, that is a decision I've made a bunch of times. I also gave up everything and sold everything and moved to Scotland once to write horror fiction, and wrote a book of horror short stories. And that was dangerous in lots of ways, not the least of which I got bit by a tick and got Lyme disease while I was there. But,
Oh, man.
But like, I mean, I feel like, I guess dangerous is also relative, right? I feel like we're very willing to be wary of what's dangerous of our career or of our finances, and less wary of what's dangerous to like our soul and our heart and who we are. It's just, we're expected to pick on those first two, and I feel like the third is the one that's really important.
I find that really fascinating, because I genuinely was going to ask you about the kind of jump around in genre, because I did notice that you had like a period of time where you put out a bunch of erotica, and then it started and then it kind of stopped. And I thought that was such a funny thing to see in someone's, basically someone's resume. And the other funny thing I thought about it was that you didn't, as far as I could tell, you didn't switch to a pseudonym for anything.
No.
This was still very much you, and you hadn't changed. You just stopped doing that one thing. And I was curious if you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I was curious if you get kind of blowback when you switch from something, especially something that is I guess adult niche as erotica, to like writing for writing games for families and for kids and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had a big conversation about it when we were creating No Thank You Evil, which is the first kids game that I did. And like, in-house at the company, we're a super supportive team, and everyone's quite liberal. And so like, people were like, we'll just, if people give us blowback, everyone has our support and it'll all work out, and we're not worried about it, right? It's not an issue. And we didn't really get a lot of blowback. Now I think times are changing and we're becoming more Puritan, and lots of other things that we'll just set over here on the side because the world is bad over here. We'll talk about other things that are more interesting. And so I think that could change. I mean, I don't think it will because, like, for example, my writing about sex was so long ago that people aren't going to dig it up and make a fuss. But I mean, people are always up in arms. I had so many people yelling at me in general when I was writing erotica because I was going to hell. And I had someone show up on my porch once and tell me I was going to go to hell because I wrote lesbian erotica. And I sort of crave those old days, right? Where that was like the worst that was happening. And so, yeah, I haven't, I sort of have felt like it's part of my job in the world as a writer, as a creative, is to be there, is to be present and be proud of the things I create, not in a like, this is the perfect book kind of way, because of course not, but in this sort of like, it's okay to talk about sex. It's okay to talk about this. It's okay to talk about that. It's awesome to play games. Like all the things that have kind of been swept under the radar or frowned upon or dismissed. Like if I'm going to put my heart into a thing and earn money from that thing, I feel like personally, and I know everyone's decisions are different, I feel like I should be willing to stand up for that thing, right? I should be there. I should have my name on it. I should be present. You know, if I get flack, I should be willing to stand up and be like, this is why that flack is really dumb. So yeah. And also like, there's a privilege there that comes from like, my family is supportive. I'm white and middle class, you know, I'm bi, but like nobody can tell unless I tell them. And again, I'm very open about that because I want people to feel like that's just normal. And so I understand that I have a lot of privilege. You know, I don't have kids, that other people who use pseudonyms don't have that safety net. And so I'm certainly not judging people who make different decisions. It just felt like the right one for me.
Well, that's really interesting. It's so funny because so much of what you're saying kind of like it goes against the grain of all of my instincts as like
Interesting.
as a business person. And I don't mean this in a bad way because I find that kind of decision making, gosh, I'm so jealous of it. I'm jealous of that ability to say this thing, I'm no longer interested in it. I'm going to work on something else. Or saying like, okay, so like literally like right during the middle of the pandemic, I had this thought of like, man, I'm feeling a little burnt out. I need to switch it up. And I genuinely had a thought of, what if I just, you know, like screw around and write some erotica just for fun? And then I had this like for a good week, I was thinking about this and I thought, and the conclusion I came to was, you know what, if I actually tried to put something out there, even under a pseudonym, even hiding everything, and anyone found out, I don't want even a single email from people giving me crap about, oh, you're using your powers for evil or whatever. And I just that like, and it just broke the whole idea down completely. And I just thought, you know, I don't need that. And I kind of cling to what little security I've able to kind of, you know, scrounge out in this weird career I have.
You know, that's so valid though, right? I mean, I think everyone's perception of what's right for them is so different. And the fact that we're asking is actually the important part, right? Like the answers don't matter half as much as like, hey, like no bullshit. What would this affect, or what would it take to do this, or what are the repercussions of this? And am I willing to like sit down with them and deal with them on a regular old Monday? Like, I think asking those questions is, God, it's so vital. And it saves so much potentially bad stuff in the long run, even if you end up choosing in maybe a direction that you wish you hadn't, right? But at least thinking about it allows you to say, all right, well, these are the things that could happen. Am I willing to sacrifice, or am I willing to deal with that? And if the answer is no, then God, yeah, absolutely don't do it. Although I totally want to read your erotica.
I imagine it would probably be way too much world building and way too little sex.
Oh, that's awesome though. Erotic world building. I like it.
Right. I joked on a panel once because I got this new universe that just came out a couple of weeks ago. Now that we're recording this, and the like one of the main centers of the universe is glass that is made so anybody can use magic if they've got these little bits of glass that accentuate human properties. And I made a joke on a panel that we were talking about what you do and don't put into a book. And my joke was, this world definitely has sex toys made of god glass. I'm
Yeah.
never going to mention them on the page. They're never gonna show up in my books because my books tend to be pretty PG-13, but that's definitely a thing that exists.
That's awesome. God glass. I love it. That's super cool.
And that kind of thing, that is an interesting like thought. I sometimes come back to is, because a lot of us would take writing classes, we learn from other writers, we talk through kind of our processes, and what you're going to have to decide what you want in a book in terms of content, honestly, is one of those things you really have to deal with at some point. And you might not even think about it for the first many years of your career. But there's going to be a point at which you realize, oh, like this thing that I just wrote, it could be kind of offensive to certain people. Whether I agree with them or not, they're still maybe my readers. And that kind of thing, but also, like what you're going to have to deal with in terms of reader feedback. And sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative.
Yeah.
But I feel like when you're a young writer, it's something you don't think about ever.
Boy, that's interesting because I feel like, when I go back and look at some of my early stuff, I think I was just, you're just putting your heart on the page, or you're putting your experience, or you're playing with language, or whatever you're doing. Like, I definitely, God, when I started, we were still doing paper envelopes for submissions, and the internet was just barely a thing. And like, I couldn't even have imagined this sort of access that people have now to, just everything. And so, there was definitely a lot less thought about people being able to reach you in that way. Mostly people had to mail you a letter or show up at your house, which, it actually takes a lot of work. And so very few people are willing to do that. But, to come send you an email now or come back at you in the social media is like, it's just so easy for people that they can I just read this great essay this morning by Roxane Gay called Feedback Loop. And it was all about that, like how accessible we as creatives are to, people whose opinions we shouldn't even have access to. Like, they don't matter to us, right? They're just spouting off these opinions that have the potential to make us feel really crappy for no reason. Like, why do we need to know that? Why do they need to have access to us? Like, there's just a lot of questions around the world today that it's hard because all the good things, it's like playing the lottery, because every once in a while you get this really great response from a reader and you're like, oh, my heart, you're amazing. Thank you. I love you. You got it. I'm so glad I could affect your life. And then, you get just this little horrible note from somebody that you don't even know and care about. And it drags you down for such a long time. And I feel like I keep things around for those once in a million lottery tickets of nice people saying nice things, and got to go through the dregs to get it.
Well, and it's interesting kind of what you said about the kind of the connectedness and like that ability to get feedback instantaneously, and see what people like or don't like, if you care to look for it. I thought that as of probably my third book, I had totally gotten over the checking Amazon, checking Goodreads, that kind of thing. For my second trilogy, I don't think I did at all. Maybe a little bit on the first book, but generally I felt really good about having gotten away from that. Man, for the new book, it's a new world, and so my brain's like, oh, you better find out if they like it.
Yeah.
And so I kept checking, and it's only like the last 3 days I've been kind of like, okay, slow down. You don't need to look at reviews ever again.
Yeah.
But what's wild is that I can do that. Like 15 years ago, you wouldn't have had, this ability to just look up reviews of your own books.
Right. It's so true. You would have, only if you were big enough to make it into one of the print publications that reviewed things, right? And then it was very thoughtful, and that's what they did for a living. And even if they dragged you through the mud, at least you were getting, people were writing about you in ways that were interesting.
well, and it's what's funny about the trade reviews is that nowadays they get so many books to review that oftentimes I'll read a review and I'll be like, oh, I got a starred review. That's amazing. And I'll read and I'll go, this person clearly did not read the book.
Oh no.
They clearly looked at it, said, yeah, this is the type of thing I'd like. I'll give it a starred review. And it makes you feel kind of crappy because you're like, oh,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sympathetic because they're so busy, but also you're like, come on, guys, this is like your job.
Yeah. Yeah, I do feel like sometimes I pick up a book that got reviewed and everyone's taste is different, but still I'm like, really? This is the one you liked?
Oh, it's absolutely bizarre. The other thing with that kind of that interconnectedness is that it jumps into something I noticed for this new book that I had come out was that they were sending review copies to a ton of people who had never read my books before, which is really good. You want
Yeah.
that access, but also you get this weird crossing of genres, and you'll see like a review pop up for an epic fantasy novel that from someone who normally, like, you scroll through and they're like, oh, they like do YA, they do romance. Why did they get one of these books? But like, that's sent out, that's great. But you see this crossing of genres, you see this strange sort of people who under normal circumstances probably would never pick up your book,
Right.
And they grab it, they get it from the publisher, and then suddenly they're talking about these things, and I'm like, and you're trying to be like, oh, well, you don't engage with this sort of thing, right? Obviously.
Right.
And you don't, but in your brain you're kind of shadow boxing this
At night,
invisible
you're like,
person.
yeah. Dear reviewer. It's true. I feel like my favorite reviews are the ones that start out with like, I don't read this kind of book, but you're like, no, just don't read it then. That's okay. My favorite review ever that I got was a 1-star review on Amazon for Best Lesbian Erotica. And the review said, these are all women having sex. I don't know why it's all women in this book. And I was like, it says Best Lesbian Erotica in the title. What did you expect? Like, I found it so delightful. It sort of changed the way I look at reviews for the rest of my life, because it was so insidious and insipid that I was just like, okay, I never have to believe a bad review ever again from someone who clearly is not paying attention.
Yeah, there's actually something really comforting about those moments when you realize this person has far lower just this person doesn't kind of read like I do. Clearly they are either skimming or glancing or something, and you feel kind of relieved, right? You're just like, right. Oh, well, in the back of my brain, I can call them a moron and move on with my life.
Yeah, Brené Brown, I don't know if you have read her stuff, but she has this really great philosophy that, like, if someone's not in the ring fighting with you, you don't have to take their punches. And I really, like, she doesn't say it. She's much more eloquent than that. But that's how I think of it, is if you're not in here doing the level of reading and writing and thinking about stories that I am, I don't have to take your punches, because I spend a lot of time reading and writing and thinking about stories. And if you do too, then I value your opinion so much, right? I want to hear how to get better. I want your feedback. I love your critique. But if you don't, then I can make the choice to not bear the brunt of whatever you bring. And so, like, I think about that all the time, of like, has someone, I spent 3 years writing this book and someone didn't actually read it and spent 5 minutes telling me how horrible it was. Do I have to take that punch? No, I totally don't, right? I can just walk away. And I think that's really useful too, but hard, right? I sound like I always react so well to negativity, but of course I don't, right? The unexpected ones sting, and you're just like, oh, ouch. And like, we said, you want to reply, or you want to say something, you want to justify that or even be like, oh no, am I really that bad? That's the place that sometimes gets to me. It's like, oh no, I have this very tenuous grip on whether or not I'm good at what I do, and you just shook that grip all to pieces, and how do I get that back? And so it isn't quite as easy as I make it sound, but it helps me to kind of keep that in mind sometimes.
Well, the most crushing reviews are always the things that they don't even have to mention it in great detail, but mention whatever it is that you are insecure about as a writer.
Yes.
The moment that review says, such and such, like, such and such is not quite grasping this one character, and that's the character you worked the hardest on because you didn't think you were doing it right. And you're like, oh, I failed all that work and I failed.
Yep. Oh, I am. Yep.
That is the worst. That's the very worst. But there's the kind of there's the opposite side of that ecosystem where you as a consumer, you kind of understand that reviews exist for a reason,
Mhm.
and it helps people find books and it helps people avoid books that they don't want. It's just like me looking at the reviews for a restaurant I'm going to go to.
Right.
And so you try to not take it personally because
Yeah.
it's just part of life.
It is, right? And there's that adage about growing a thick skin, which I do think is really important for creatives. Like I can remember when I used to work on an ambulance and as a volunteer firefighter, and I can remember one of the paramedics when I was in training was telling me about sort of the God complex that paramedics have, where you have to like have all this thick skin, but at the same time you have to be willing to know that at any moment you're going to fail, and in your failure someone's going to die. Right. And I think about that all the time as a creative too. Like this idea that I need to have thick skin, but I also need to be willing at all times to accept that I have failed, or that I haven't done what I hoped I'd do, or that this project isn't going to work, or that people aren't going to like it. And so there's this weird and interesting ego balance of I'm doing my best, and that might be awesome, and even in doing my best it might also be awful. And how do you keep those two things in yourself all the time without tipping over, especially when people are, you're sort of people are talking to you on the internet. Sometimes you're just like, I don't know, it's a very fine balance to keep producing. I think that there's so many hurdles to us continuing to be creative and continuing to make what we love. And it's like if you jump over this hurdle today, it somehow grows bigger and smacks you in the face tomorrow.
That's so true. We've talked a bit about how kind of writing and the writing ecosystem has changed. I was curious about how things have changed for gaming over the last decade, even. What have you kind of seen? What is as somebody who runs a business but also works in that kind of creatively as part of that business? Like what do you guys what kind of challenges do you guys run into that maybe you didn't see right at the beginning?
Well, that's interesting. So I think this challenge. Let me tackle the changes part first and see if I can think of any challenges. So the changes, I think, like so many of the changes are good, despite what sometimes it seems like when you might look at gaming social media, because of course the sort of crap rises to the top and all that. But like we have such better representation and diversity and inclusion, and like I know that we have so far to go, and I don't know if we'll ever achieve what I would like to see the industry achieve, but like we have so many more people not just playing games but creating games, working in games, and creating their own products. And some of that is crowdfunding, and some of that is platforms like itch.io. And like there's just so many great there's so many great changes happening, and that it's sort of not the old white cis hetero guys club anymore. And I think that we're getting better games for it. I mean, there's these amazing games that are coming out from individual creators and creators who are doing things in small groups that we never ever would have seen because they didn't have the platform. People didn't know how to get in. There were too many gatekeepers. So that's like a huge change that we're seeing. And it's so good for gaming. And part of it is because there's the conflict that hopefully is pushing the sort of the bad eggs out farther and farther, and until they eventually just sort of go, I don't know, make their own thing somewhere else. But that's the big one for me is, and tied into that, like I said, is crowdfunding, which is giving lots of people opportunities to make even really cool, interesting small games that get big followings and win awards and all kinds of things. And there's some really great organizations out there that are doing work to help provide opportunities for marginalized creators, and we're seeing a lot more of that, which makes me super happy. And of course, with D&D's explosion over the last 5 years in particular, it's sort of had this re-explosion, I guess. It means it's bringing all the sort of boats up with the tide in that way. And so I think lots of companies are experiencing sort of secondary success on the heels of D&D sort of getting so big, and that's great, right? The more people that play games, the more creative the world, the more empathetic the world. We want all of these things. I think the challenge that the challenges that we did not see coming perhaps are, um, the obvious one for us right now is the effects that COVID's had on prices and supply chain. Everything's running late, and when you work on Kickstarter time and you make promises to your backers, at least we have a global excuse, I guess, for being late, right? And that there's no cargo ships, or something's stuck in the Suez Canal, and there's a crisis, and there's another pandemic. I mean, it's just, the world is just such a such a disaster that it sort of feels like the difference between calling your boss at work and being like, I'm sick, and being like, the building's on fire, I can't come to work, right? One is really obvious and everyone knows you're telling the truth. So I think that the pandemic and the state of the world has been unexpected and difficult in those ways. You're sometimes just getting products made outside of our company, when you put it in someone else's hands, who knows when you're going to see it ever again, or if it's going to end up in the bottom of some ocean somewhere. That's probably the biggest one that we have encountered.
I definitely when I'm dealing with things kind of personally, I definitely have a mix of the of my professional brain versus my consumer brain. And so like I get, I'll get the emails for the updates for Frosthaven, once every month or two. And my consumer brain is going, oh my gosh, it's still not here. Come on, that was so long ago. And my professional brain is going, holy shit, the logistics that these poor people have to deal with for such a massive undertaking. And so you kind of you bounce back and forth between those two things.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's so much easier to lean on the side of the like, oh, those, the huge process, and have sympathy now that everyone has learned. I think most people have learned a lot more about how the supply chain works, right? If you just sort of didn't work in an industry that delivered a thing, you might not even know how that all works, or all the pieces that are involved, or all the people that are involved. And I do think that there's more compassion now that people see how complex it is. It's kind of amazing that we ever get anything on time, really.
It really is. It's quite incredible. Now, I was curious if you have any thoughts on the way kind of gaming as a developing medium, like how has interest changed? Because you mentioned the explosion of D&D, but also we get tons and tons of indie games. You see this in tabletop board games. You also see it in video games.
Yeah.
I play tons of video games, to the point where I mostly play indie games these days. And I'm kind of curious how maybe the types of games that people play has shifted.
It's sort of so, I'm so hesitant to speak on a larger scale because I feel like I can only speak from my perspective. So with that in mind, I feel like there's this interesting, there's been this sort of resurgence of old school Renaissance games where, and even that's kind of breaking apart into sort of two groups. One that is really more old school values, I'll say, and then one that's just really loves old school games. And so that's been interesting to watch that sort of rise and then break into two. I think that people are playing a lot more online because of the COVID situation. And so I think that companies that can offer an online, I don't know, like platform in which to play games are probably seeing probably seeing a surge. I don't know for sure, but it seems like that would be the case. And then I think also people are a lot more people are watching games being played than ever before. I mean, that's just a new part of our industry of, live play and all those kinds of things. And that's really interesting because it's taking these sort of two groups that want to do two different things in some aspects, right? And one is the players and one is the viewers. And I think a lot of times viewers also are players or want to be players, but don't have a group or don't have access or don't have the things that they need to be consistent. And so like these two really interesting elements are coming together to create something that's really quite new. And so one of the things that I think we're seeing is the rise of like professional GMs or professional groups, because playing a game in which you are being watched in that way is it's very acting heavy. It's very voice work heavy. It isn't the same as sitting around at home. And so there's been a little bit of interesting conversation about like, well, my game doesn't play like the games I watch. And am I doing it wrong? And of course you're not doing it wrong. You just don't happen to be a professional actor or voice actor and have a group of other actors with you who are playing, but are playing with the understanding that people are viewing them or are viewing the story. And so I think there's some trepidation among people who are seeing these, live plays who don't understand why their game isn't like that. And that's, I don't want to say it's unfortunate because I think live plays are awesome, but it always makes me sad when someone feels like they can't do a thing because they're not doing it to some sort of hidden standard. So I think that one of the things that has happened a lot is like sort of educating people that of course their game is not like that. They don't, their game is not going to be like that unless that's the thing that they want to make. And then it requires work and time experience and those kinds of things.
That's really interesting. Have you guys seen an uptick in your percentage of sales that are digital versus hard copy?
We saw an uptick in general during the pandemic. It didn't seem to matter too much if they were digital or hard copy. But we definitely saw more people buying games in general, kind of across the board. I don't know the numbers well enough to know the difference, but I do think that for a while, because we offer stuff on our website as well as on Drive-Thru RPG, and I feel like our Drive-Thru RPG sales were really high in the first 6 months of the pandemic, like higher than normal. So maybe, but we also came out with a game specifically designed to be played online. It has like an app. And that was very popular too in the beginning of the pandemic because, you could create a game while having all your pieces on the computer and it was click through. And so we did this whole thing because it sounded fun and experimental. And we thought people need something to do. And it came out great. And now we're doing a book version of that. So it's interesting how that game kind of went backwards from our normal route.
Oh, that's actually really funny. And what game is that?
It's called The Darkest House. It's kind of a horror game, and so the app has like maps, and you can click through the room, and the GM can get clues, and then you can make it. It's really easy to show all your players the pictures on Zoom or whatever you're using to play on. And so now that we just finished putting the book together for The Darkest House, so it's kind of a cool backwards experience.
That is actually quite cool. I remember early on in the pandemic trying to get a couple of those, is it Tabletop Simulator on Steam, trying to get that to work with a couple of kind of the big games. I think we were trying to do Pandemic Legacy, and I remember we all got quite frustrated trying to make make it work. And then eventually, like I think Gloomhaven came out with an official game that was online, but by that time, all of us had gone and done our own things and lost that game night. But I got to imagine that there's a few success stories of people that were developing something for that platform for that reason that came out 3 months into the pandemic and just totally made bank.
I think so, right? It's sort of the Animal Crossing kind of experience, right? Where they just happen to have perfect timing for a thing that everybody really, really wanted and needed.
Yeah, sometimes luck is what you need.
It is true.
It's pretty crazy. Now I was just perusing your Twitter and I noticed that you enjoy gardening. Now, do you mind saying where you're located at?
Oh, no, we're outside of Seattle.
Okay. I thought as much, but I wasn't 100% sure. But it's just so gorgeous and green. I've learned that there's parts of Seattle that look very much like where I grew up in the Midwest. And specifically in the corner of Ohio that has some actual hills. But it's very green and very pretty. What do you like to garden?
I'm a sporadic gardener. So my favorite things to garden are things that I can plant when I have the energy to plant something and that sort of survive through the following neglect. So we have about a half of an acre, which is why we live outside of Seattle because nobody can afford that in Seattle. And it's a lot of wildflowers. I'm a huge fan of bees and the little things. We have tree frogs and coyotes that come to our yard. And the other day there was a deer eating my strawberries, which I was not super thrilled about because we have a lot of slugs here. The Pacific Northwest is slug haven. And so if you don't put copper tape around things and raise them, the slugs will just demolish them. And so I put this copper tape around my strawberry things and I raised them, and it turns out I raised them right to deer height. So, so he was out there just taking giant handfuls of ripe strawberries in a single bite. But he was very fun to watch. And we have bears and, like I said, coyotes. I think we saw wolves earlier this year and owls. And we sort of have this, we have green space on two sides. So they kind of use our path as a walkway. So I do a lot of natural stuff, things that, the bunnies like and all that kind of stuff, which I'm not 100% sure the neighbors appreciate because, it's a clover lawn and, but the animals appreciate it and I care more about them. So...
I was very jealous of your strawberries. I'm one of those people. I grew up with like a big garden. My parents were really into like trying to like be self-sufficient and everything. I hated every moment of it as a child. But as an adult, I've kind of come to appreciate, when I can get something to grow. And the only thing I've ever been competent at as an adult is raspberries, because you like take really good care of them at the beginning of the season, like in March, and get them all trimmed properly and set up with some trellises. And then you don't really have to do anything but pick them.
Oh yeah,
which I can deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But man, I would love to be able to grow some really proper good strawberries, because strawberries are one of those things that when I was a kid, my mom would send us to go pick strawberries at like the local farm, and they were always amazing and delicious. Mm-hmm. But any strawberry you can get from like like just a store, they kind of taste a little acidic and they're not sweet, and I'd love to learn to grow them myself properly.
Yeah, the sugar makes them rot faster, right? So they take the varieties. I knew I was going to come up with that word eventually. They take the varieties that have less sugar for that kind of shipping, right? So they're always a little white inside and they don't taste very good, but like sun picked and they're all warm, and that's absolutely my favorite thing. I really love that. The Pacific Northwest is hard for gardening because there's and also we have trees on two sides, so we have a lot of shade. So things like tomatoes and stuff are just they're not possible here. So I tend to grow the things like a lot of lettuce and I have snap peas this year. And so it's a lot of things that don't care that it's never going to get any sun.
Yeah, I live in Utah, where the only way I can grow tomatoes is by putting them in the shade because it's so hot.
Oh,
it's so hot, so dry. And I tried doing them out in full sun, out in the front of the yard, and they just withered and died.
Oh, no.
So quickly.
Yeah.
It got so frustrating.
Oh, yeah. I would love to grow tomatoes. Tomatoes are like the acme of growing vegetables, and I haven't been able to pull it off here.
I got really good at it in Ohio when I lived in Ohio, but that's like on easy mode because it's wet and it's it's raining all the time. You put them in a raised bed and they're pretty much fine.
Yeah.
But that's how it is sometimes when you've got like a place where things are meant to live, which isn't Utah.
Yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, and I feel like gardening as a kid was very much like that. You just put a thing in the ground and ta-da! When I moved out here, I was like, what is happening? Either I don't know how to do this, or this is really hard for reasons I haven't figured out. And of course, it was a little bit of both because every area has different needs, and I did not yet understand that.
It's one of those weird things to learn, because gardening as an adult, some people genuinely use it as like a source of food for their family and things like that. But I think for most people that garden as an adult, it's a little hobby that they do to try to have some joy in nature and outside in their yard and stuff. And when it's that kind of casual hobby, you don't necessarily get good at testing the soil. And
that's so true. Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, I feel like, which leads me to think, of course, about how we so often take our hobbies and try to monetize them, and how if I don't have a lot of time for a thing, of course I'm not going to get good at it because I don't. But then I run the risk of trying to get good at it, and then I think, oh, I should do it. I should make a job out of this, which has burnt me in the past. So
same here. No, that's absolutely burnt me. I did beekeeping for several years, and I did, and I loved it. I still have all my equipment. I really loved doing it. But like every single year, it was like one of those things of, oh man, the weekend where the honey is going to be perfect and right before a cold snap hits, I really should get out and harvest. Oh, that's the weekend of a convention.
Oh, yeah.
Like I started running into kind of the, late fall and, kind of the May conventions for setting things up. And I realized that this is a hobby that I don't have the time in the right spots to put the energy into. And I don't know, maybe someday I'll start it up again, but it was also really fun. Like until those moments where I would think, well, because I'm stretching myself a little bit, maybe I should make money off of this. Should I print off labels? Should I try to sell at a local farmer's market? And I'm like, no, I can't do all of that junk.
Yeah.
Like, but your brain's always kind of trying to say, yeah, monetize your hobby.
Yeah, that temptation is real.
Sometimes that's a bad idea.
Oh, yeah. Right. And it turns a thing of joy into a thing of something else, which isn't devoid of joy, but also isn't pure joy the way that a hobby can be. So I love that you were a beekeeper, though. If I was not quite so fickle, I would totally love to keep bees. But I know myself well enough to know that, I need something that doesn't require me to be consistent across time and space, because I'm just not. Just can't do that.
Yeah, I've found that about myself over the last few years, especially is that when it comes to hobbies, I am quite fickle, and I like being able to change them. And that's why playing video games is a good hobby, because if I'm not liking a game, I can shut it down and start a new one in 10
Yep.
seconds.
Yes. Oh, the glory of Game Pass, right? Is that I can try out 20 games a month and it doesn't cost me anything. And I love that so much. I love that first moment of opening a new game, and you don't know anything and everything's new and you don't know what anything does or how to it's just, I love that moment so much. Of course, by then, and then it's only a few games that make it past that sort of opening joy moment. Once I figure a thing out, I'm like, okay, am I still liking this game, or was it just the appeal of something new?
Yeah, yeah. For me, I can always tell if a game really struck, because there's there's the game that I opened it, went, nah, I'm not going to play that again, and closed it, and it's got 3 minutes on Steam, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the game that has 10 hours. And
Yep.
those games, I'm like, oh, well, that was a competently made game. I enjoyed it for a while. Fine. And then there's the games that have way too many zeros on it on the hour line. And those are the games that you're just like, this is genius. This is brilliant. It struck something inside me that I don't even know how to express. I mean, that happened, I think, man, did it come out right at the beginning of the pandemic? Have you played Valheim?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yep.
That happened to me with Valheim. Valheim just hit me in the place that hit my childhood, like my childhood gamer.
Oh, wow.
And I've put so many 100 hours. That was part of one of the things that got me through the pandemic. It's
Yeah.
so good.
It's interesting too, because I'm very graphic focused. Like, I really love beautiful games, which Valheim is sort of, right? I mean, your character is not that great looking. And the fact that I played as much of it as I did, considering the graphics, like, says how much I loved that game, because the graphics are not amazing. I mean, it's a beautiful game in many ways, but it's also sort of like, I really want to be able to make my character look like something else.
Well, and I've actually found that I really love those kind of style of indie games where they kind of give up the graphics, because
Yeah.
the graphics have never gotten me as much as gameplay mechanics.
Oh, yeah.
And Valheim's definitely one of those that gave up on graphics in order to make the game really lovable, and that's what I like about it.
Yeah, me too. I'm a sucker for games that feel like you can just feel the joy and the love from the creators in the game, and it's a very intangible thing, but it's there, and it sucks you in this really wonderful way.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I have been eating up tons of your afternoon, but we like to finish off these episodes by asking a really simple left field question, which is, what's the last thing that you ate that blew your mind?
Oh, boy, the last thing I ate that blew my mind was, it's been so long since I have eaten outside my own cooking and my own house.
Well, it can include your own cooking.
I don't usually blow my mind with my own cooking, unfortunately. Oh, I here's what I will say is the last thing I ate that blew my mind was a box of cookies from Crumble Cookies. and there was a Reese's peanut butter something in there, and it was gooey and chocolatey, and I love chocolate and peanut butter anyway. And it was like they delivered them warm, and it was a little salty, and it was one of those things where you eat it so slowly because it's somehow everything came together perfectly to create something so much greater than both your expectations and what it should be, right? Which is what we all hope when we're creating things. But it happens so rarely. And I think that's the last thing that I had that just made me stop and be like, okay, this is where all of your attention is right now.
When we first moved to Utah about 6 years ago, we discovered Crumble Cookie through a friend. And I think there was like one in the area at the time, and now there's like 12. But we overdid it to the point where I kind of got over Crumble Cookie. But I will admit that their Nutella, when they have it, is just oh my gosh. It's like a snickerdoodle with Nutella on it.
Oh yeah.
And it's so stupidly good. Absolutely love it.
Now I want cookies.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be off sugar right now. So. That was game designer Shanna Germain. Thanks again to Shanna for taking the time to chat. You can find links to her website and social media down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. Reminder that we're taking the rest of the summer off, but we'll be back with Season 2 of Page Break this fall. In the meantime, you can listen back to your favorite episodes or catch up on those you missed, read In the Shadow of Lightning, and have a good summer. Special thanks to James Sutter for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. You can also get signed copies of my books direct from my website or swag from my Redbubble store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Huge thanks to Kyle Anderson, Patrick Hunt, Elijah, Jennifer and Angela Johnson, and Ivor Gullickson for their backing on Patreon.